I hope by now you've had a chance to download the PDF that I posted online, as well as the little Word doc that has the various questions for you to engage in the investigation into the historical critical context of Mark. So, what we're doing with this lecture is asking the big W questions. Any questions an historical, critical thinker, a historian might ask. Who wrote the gospel? Who was the audience? For whom was it written? Where might they have been? And when was the text written? Why? What was the text getting at? And about what? And so for each of these, I've given you a set of questions to engage in your PDF. And so I hope you've downloaded them. And the idea is that you're going to watch this video, and I'm going to sort of walk you through the investigation. So at times I'll be asking you to pause and stop the video and do some work, and then we'll come back and we'll talk through what you found. Okay, I hope that helps you work your way through this lecture. First question is who? So I'm asking you with these questions to determine who the author of the second gospel was. Asking such questions as what was the gospel's writer's name, and how do we know that? And what can we learn about him? I'm going to ask you now to, after I say pause, to pause this letter and go back and read the beginning and end of Mark and read this account by Papias. It's linked to your resource. Just go ahead and read this. Go ahead and pause and come back, and we'll talk in a second. So let's start with the Papias account. So if you read the Papias account, he writes, concerning Mark, who wrote the gospel, he, that's Papias, expounds with these words. And the elder also said this, Mark, being the interpreter or translator of Peter, wrote accurately all that he remembered, but not, however, in order. The things which were spoken are done by our Lord. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but later, as I said, he followed Peter, who provided instruction according to the need, but not as to make an orderly account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark did not err in anything in thus writing such things, as he remembered them. For he was attentive to one thing, not to leave out anything that he heard, or to make any false statements in them. So then, these things were recorded by Papias concerning Mark. When you engage in historical critical questions, and you look at Papias, you have to ask, how close to the source was he? Well, Papias is recorded in Eusebius. Take a second, pause, Google Eusebius. When was he living? Okay, you've come back, and you see that Eusebius wrote in the 4th century. So Eusebius is writing about Papias, and if you read carefully the Papias account, you see that Papias heard this about Mark from John. Okay, so and when did Papias live? You can Google Papias. He lived in the early 2nd century. So you've got Papias, who's writing around 120, about John, who told him that Mark wrote the gospel based upon what he heard from Peter, and he didn't do a very good job with it. I mean, Papias is kind of critical of Mark. He didn't do a great job of it. He did as best he can. And all of this, the best, earliest account we have is from the 4th century. Would you say that this is critically the best evidence we have for Mark? Okay, so you've read also Mark 1 through 8 and 16 1 through 8. Did you find Mark's name either at the beginning or at the end saying, hey, Mark wrote this? No, you didn't. So I'll leave that up to you. Do we have reliable evidence for the name of the gospel writer? We have third-hand evidence. fourth-hand evidence from the 4th century? Not terribly reliable. Now, would the church have made this up? I don't think so. They'd have no reason to lie. So, I don't think they made up that Mark wrote this thing. It's just not the best historical evidence. And there's no internal evidence. The best evidence that you can look for is internal evidence, is evidence from the source itself. Not secondhand, but primary. We don't have that. So the best way to answer who is, I'll let you determine that. We don't know. We know only based upon the, I'll let you guys write what you think there in terms of your answers. Don't worry about whether you get it right or not. I just want you to think. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, read these passages. Read the first set of clues up here and read the second set of clues down here. From the first set of clues, these up here, I hope you saw that the thing that was in common with all of them were that we had Roman words. You had the Roman centurion here in 1539. You had the language that there's legions, that's the Roman sort of unit, army unit. You have references to Roman coins. Clearly, the audience that Mark was writing to was familiar with these Latin terms, the Roman army terms, and Roman money. So where could they have been? They could have been anywhere in the Roman Empire. So that doesn't really narrow it down, but we at least know that they were somewhere in the Roman Empire. Now, if you get into this next set of clues, I'm going to pick 1534 to talk about, because I think it's a famous phrase. The 7 last words of Christ. People talk about this being one of the 7 last words of Christ. At 1534, at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Most of us don't know Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani unless you happen to be an Aramaic reader. You can read ancient Aramaic. It means, well, Mark tells you what it means. My God, why have you forsaken me? The cool thing about this is in the Gospel of Mark, these words, they're spelled out in Greek, but they really are the Aramaic. But then Mark goes along and translates for his audience, my God, why have you forsaken me? He tells them what it means in Greek. What that tells us is that Mark's audience didn't know Aramaic. That's a huge clue. That means that if we come back to here, to our slide, it means that we can rule out a huge geographic region and ethnic identity of the audience. They probably were not Jewish. They probably were not Aramaic speakers. But they could speak Greek. Well, anyone in the Roman Empire could speak at least a little bit of Greek. And they were very familiar with Roman terms. Maybe they were in the empire closer to Italy or Rome, right? So the ethnic identity of Mark's audience is probably Gentile, not Jewish, because Jews, at least Jews living in Palestine, would have known Aramaic, at least enough Aramaic to identify Eloi lema sabachthani. That's pretty cool, right? And you'll see throughout these clues, if you read it, you saw like Talita Kum and a whole bunch of other little Aramaic references, and every time Mark translates it for his audience, he knows that his audience doesn't know Aramaic. So they weren't in Palestine. They weren't in Israel. They were somewhere else in the Roman Empire. My guess is they were in Rome, but I'll talk more about that in a second. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, the next slide asks you to look at verse 31 in chapter 7. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of Decapolis. Now, open your book to page 66. If you've got the third edition, it's in 65. This is referring to the third edition. If you've got the fourth edition, it's page 66. You should see a map there. Look at the top of the map. You'll see Tyre and Sidon at the very top. And it says he went from Tyre all the way over to the Sea of Galilee. You see the Sea of Galilee? It's over to the right, below Tyre. So it says he returned from the region of Tyre and then went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. Why in the world would he go up to Sidon? I don't know. Maybe he had to pick up some donuts. Jesus, early cop. Had to stop. And I'm sorry. I know some of you are criminal justice majors, but no. I don't think that was it. What scholars believe is that maybe the author himself was not from the geographic region of Palestine. He would have surely known that Sidon is north of Tyre, and you don't go to Sea of Galilee by way of Sidon unless some people say, well, maybe there was a road because there's mountains. He's trying to avoid the mountains. I don't know. It's a lot to make out of a little map. But it's possible that the gospel writer was not from Galilee himself. He wasn't writing to people in Israel, and maybe he himself didn't know the geographic region. Interestingly enough, that squares with what we know about Mark. Peter, of course, was from Israel, but Mark himself not. So maybe he just didn't know the geography. Interesting. Okay, pause. We'll go on to the next slide. For this slide, I really want you to read these passages that are linked to your PowerPoint. So just go ahead and, if you've got it open, go ahead and read the Suetonius and Tacitus passages. Okay, if you've pause and read it. Okay, if you've read it, you know that Suetonius and Tacitus are talking about these terrible, awful, violent things that were happening in Rome in the 60s, in which Christians were being persecuted. Okay, pause the video again and read, when I tell you to, these clues, 440 and 515, and then especially these clues, 831, 37, 930 through 37, 1032 through 35, and 13, 9 through 13. Okay, just read, read all of these. If you've read them, you've probably seen some of the same words appearing. You've seen the language of fear that is repeated again and again and again in Mark. They were afraid. In fact, the very last verse, 16:8, the women run in fear from the grave. And then you read the predictions in which Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, if you want to follow me, prepare to be persecuted. Well, if we look at that, and we look at what Suetonius and Tacitus tells us, and if we buy what we read in Papias, at least with a grain of salt, hey, maybe we do have a time and a location and an audience. Maybe the earliest readers of Mark's gospel had just experienced persecution like the one described in Suetonius and Tacitus by Nero. And they were living a life full of fear. And they would have been very comforted by Jesus predicting that they themselves are going to experience persecution. And then if you focus on 13, 1 through 2 and 13, 14, you realize Mark had to know that the temple in Rome was going to be destroyed, and probably this was happening while Rome was occupying Palestine between 60 and 66 and 70, because everybody knew when the Romans went to occupy a city, they were going to destroy it, especially if there was resistance. It all fits. The Christians had been persecuted in the 60s. The Romans probably were surrounding Jerusalem, about to destroy the temple. And Mark decides to get from Peter. The tradition is that Peter also perhaps was crucified upside down. We don't know, or 64-ish in Rome under Nero. We don't know. But given those experiences, it's possible. I think it's a strong candidate, strong possibility that the gospel was written to a community that had just experienced persecution. Go on to the next slide. This slide, I think, is interesting because if you read these passages, and I want you to pause and read them, so pause and read them and come back. So now that you've read these passages, you see that nobody really gets who Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark, except for the centurion at the very end who says, surely this was God's son. Nobody gets it. Everybody, Peter kind of gets it, but then he denies Jesus in the end, or he's shushed. Jesus tells him, "Get behind me, Satan." Call him Satan. And as you did the reading in Ehrman, you probably found that throughout Gospel of Mark, there's this notion of this messianic secret that Jesus doesn't want any of the characters to know that he is the Messiah. Now, this is a theological claim that Mark is making. Remember, I talked about the possibility, the reality that historical criticism can't get at a theological claim. But we can get at what the gospel writer was trying to do. And here's what I think was going on. Put yourself in the shoes of the first century reader. Imagine you have just experienced persecution in your life. I mean, the terrible kind of persecution described by Tacitus and Suetonius, where they took Christians, they put them on crosses, they slaughtered them, they wrapped them in the skins of animals and threw them into the circus where they let lions ravage them, and they crucified Christians and used them as torches to light up the games at night. Imagine you've experienced that. And you read Mark's gospel, you're the audience intended, and you know who Jesus is. You know that Jesus is your Lord, and you know that Jesus is calling you to experience suffering, persecution. How amazing would that be to read that and to see even Peter deny Jesus in the end? But you get it. You understand it. When all the other characters don't get it in the gospel, that's huge, right? And in the end, who gets it? The enemy. The centurion says, surely this is God's son, right? That's, wow. Talk about a vindication. The one who's persecuting, they're the ones in the end who are going to get who Jesus is. What Jesus' identity is, that he's the Messiah, that he's the Son of God. Right? And you read along and you see the women fleeing in the grave in the end, and they're running in fear, and it says they didn't tell anybody anything. They didn't tell anybody anything. 16:1-8 as you read. They told nobody nothing. And yet you know the whole story because surely they did tell someone. They did tell someone that their Jesus was resurrected, that he was the Lord. Sorry, I'm preaching a little bit. Sometimes the pastor in me comes out. But you see how critical thinking can lead you to theological understanding. It can't validate the claim, but you can understand how the gospel writer was communicating the good news about Jesus to an audience that had just suffered persecution. I hope this helps. A lot of you, I saw you wrestling, right, with the historical critical stuff. You're saying, oh, this doesn't make any sense. But in the end, I hope you see how this works theologically, right? That the gospel writer was writing an audience. Now, I'm going to tell you what to believe, but I can show you how the literature works. And that's the job of a biblical scholar, is to show you how the literature works. You know, and maybe at times we have to put that faith claim aside, not put it aside, but bracket it for a second so that we can step back and do the analysis. but then we do the analysis, ideally it should fuel us to a deeper understanding of what the text is trying to do in its own historical context, in its own world. Hope this helps. Hope this was a useful exercise. I hope you were able to follow along and stop and read and get everything out of it and fill out that little form so you can upload it. I know I kind of gave you the answers, but that's the point of the exercise. All right, thank you guys.